Back in the shed again because I have been a bad, bad boy. No, that's not why. In the shed, I'm in the shed because I'm working on the cat's play yard again, so I can fix it up so they can still get something out of summer. They've been inside for a whole week and they are going crazy. But my tools need to recharge, so I'm thinking that I'll do the next video right now. And the next genre, I've never really heard a definitive name for it. I've heard a few floating around, but I can never remember any of them. The genre is kind of newish. It is essentially the magical version of cyberpunk, which is why I call it Manapunk. Mana being a common phrase for magical, or a common name for magical energy. Taken from the Bible, as far as I remember, but in the Bible it had a completely different significance, but that's beyond the scope of this. Mana is usually considered to be a kind of magical energy to use for casting spells or the like. And so Manapunk is when magical energies and magic itself becomes a kind of rebellion against society. And there are many ways that this can unfold. It kind of has the same, I wouldn't say dilemma, but it has the same deal as with post-cataclysmic fantasy, in that fantasy itself has such a potential for variety that even when you narrow it down to a concept like Manapunk, the execution of it can be so wide, so broad. But in essence, it takes the core attributes from cyberpunk, the idea of technology, or in this case magic, giving a few people in society, or even non-people, we'll get into that, an abundance of power and wealth, while everyone else gets to squabble for whatever is left. Yes, massive magic exists, powerful magical items, powerful spells, powerful wizards, and so on. But it's all downtrodden and fighting just to stay alive. It's the same dilemma as with cyberpunk, the same oxymoron, or whatever you want to call it, that when everybody has a whole lot of power, nobody really gets ahead of the field. The fights just get more brutal. So a few rise above and harness massive powers. In the case of Manapunk, those powers are often not just, I wouldn't say mundane, but what goes for mundane in a magical setting. It's not just that. I think there are dogs nearby. Don't ask me why. Uh, it's not just about having powerful magics. It's not just about having knowing really powerful spells. It's usually about very literal deals with the devil, where mighty forces are actually behind the powers, and those who have the quote unquote power are really just wielding power they were given by very, very powerful beings. So, needless to say, things can get out of hand pretty quick, and there are probably some kind of dark rituals involved. Human sacrifice is not out of the question, but sometimes it's even more sinister and diabolical than that. But yeah, powerful magic is everywhere, perhaps because of some kind of mass production, or just because everybody now knows magic. Either magic is easier to learn, or teachers are easier to get, or magic is just easier to practice for some reason. Maybe some kind of magical energy has been released and everybody's now able to use magic, or maybe someone just figured out how to teach magic on a massive scale. Maybe society just progressed in that direction. A common idea is that magic was taught by former powers in order to take power, in order to take control. And now that all but a few of those former powers are gone because power has been centralized in a few hands, the servants of the ones who lost are, well, they're just traveling the landscape, wielding insane magics, and probably trying to carve out little social niches of power for themselves. Power within power, usually, or not usually, but often, what will constitute criminals or rebels or some kind of non sanctioned powers. Or they may just be the kind of mercenaries that the ones who won the whole ordeal used to keep everyone in line. But whatever the case, powerful magic is everywhere, and life is a struggle, not just despite it, but also in part because of it. But beyond that, many of the cyberpunk themes carry over, twisted into their own new forms. The idea of powerlessness when surrounded by power, the idea that everything is confusing, that there are no easy answers. And a lot of these things actually play on the classic fantasy concept that big, complex entities are evil. Good is simple, but there's not a lot of simple left in this world. Maybe on the fringes. Maybe there are little pockets of simple that manage to escape, but live in the shadow of this looming horror. And yes, you can combine it with horror. Manapunk horror would be quite brutal, quite ruthless. Probably the subgenre of anything that's sometimes called splatterpunk, um, or grimdark. Those are kind of two sides of the same coin. Grimdark is, I've mentioned it before, is just when a genre is so dark that there is no hope and there are no heroes. It's all just grim, darkness, death, and suffering. While splatterpunk is more a gory version of it. Splatterpunk is just that life is so meaningless, or worthless, I should say, that everything is brutal and anyone could get splattered, really splattered, not just killed, splattered, torn apart in a hail of blood and guts at any point, and likely will be. I'm not sure I'm going to get into either of those two genres because they are just extremes of most other genres. I may mention them at some point. Um, but yeah, Manapunk can get into those areas, especially if it goes down the Manapunk horror path. But even without horror or other similar genres added, Manapunk is likely quite brutal. Sometimes it's physical brutality. The idea that anyone can be torn apart by magic, but also there is a dark Uno reverse card in play because very likely anyone who is worth it can also be resurrected. So those who are useful but also worthful, valuable. Those who are useful but also valuable are likely going to get thrown into do as much damage as possible, and then get completely torn apart, and then be revived again over and over and over and over again. And that kind of symbolizes the view of life that Manapunk is likely to have. Cyberpunk can have it, but because magic is more tuned towards the extremes, being completely revived from even the worst deaths is more an acceptable idea or even common idea in any magical setting. And in Manapunk, the idea of mass production and industry applies to human lives as well. If you're really good at something, you're likely going to do it and die doing it over and over and over again to make a buck or because you're controlled by someone. It is a ruthlessness and a scale of social brutality that dominates this genre, the same it does cyberpunk, but here it can be taken to ridiculous extremes because what magic is, or because of what magic can be. Add to that the notion of massive cities or other dwellings, and you take a step farther away from fantasy and closer to cyberpunk. Fantasy does have cities, even mighty cities, but the idea of urban sprawl and extreme population density is not part of classic fantasy as such. It is part of Manapunk. Life is dehumanizing, whether you're human or not. You are likely crammed into small spaces unless you have some kind of value that is rewarded by, well, by common decency, to be perfectly honest. You are treated as either a tool or product, or quite possibly as a waste product to be either recycled or done away with. And everything goes through that. There is an aspect of industrialization that doesn't get much more than a byline in cyberpunk, which is environmental degradation or environmental destruction, to be perfectly honest. And the reason it doesn't get more than a byline in usual cyberpunk is that usual cyberpunk takes place in the cities, in the sprawl, and nature is very much a distant theory, if it even exists. But in Manapunk, there is still the fantasy element of magical nature, not just the usual there is a nice forest or anything, but things like elves and fairies, and in the mountains you have the dwarves, and in other places you have other races. The fact that humans are not the only ones around means that natural spaces have their own power, and they may fight back. It might be a losing fight, it might not be a losing fight, but they will fight back. There could be endless war between fairy folk and human cities, which in regular cyberpunk would just be industrial cities simply ravaging any kind of natural landscape. But here, nature is likely to fight back. And that allows an emphasis to be put on the ruthlessness of the Manapunk urban sprawl, because now it's war. It's not just a relentless march, it's war. And that creates sides. In regular cyberpunk, it's mostly just about big corporations fighting other big corporations. Now in Manapunk, well, you don't have corporations usually. You have things like trade houses or guilds, but they are fighting outsiders. They are fighting fairy folk. They are fighting elvish tribes to dominate the forest. They are fighting dwarven kingdoms in order to extract resources from mountains. They may be fighting other creatures in other places. They may be fighting Jinn in the desert. They could be fighting merfolk because of the pollution and domination and industrialization of the oceans. Nature has more of a chance of fighting back in Manapunk, making it less of a one-way battle between man and nature, so to speak. And that makes Manapunk in certain ways even more brutal, because there are wars that there would usually not be. And again, you add to that magic, and you add to that fantasy concepts like the ancient empires. Maybe there are undead warriors of lost kingdoms. Maybe there are gods involved. I already mentioned the demonic nature of power, the possible demonic nature of power. Ancient artifacts are also more of a concept in Manapunk, as it comes from fantasy. So while a cyberpunk storyline is likely to be more about advanced technologies, perhaps exclusively about advanced technologies and corporate infighting, Manapunk can have archaeological digs trying to bring forth lost artifacts that everybody knows should be left alone, but those in tremendous power still want it, because whoever gets that gets even more power. Power begets power. Power craves power. And after all, if you're powerful enough, it's never you that gets hurt when things go wrong. You are far behind the lines. It's the people on the ground that get hurt. And most of these powers are so relentless, they will gladly see huge swaths of humans and other races be wiped out in order to get another powerful trinket to their trophy room. For the trophy room. The details, of course, are in the wind, because that depends a lot on the kind of magic involved. And you can have both hard and soft magics, although soft magics are less practical in Manapunk unless they are a different magical system. One magical system might be hard magic, which has that cold, cynical, technological feel to it, even if it does deal with things that are not just metal and fuel. Even if it does deal with spirits, it's still cold and calculated. But there might be other magics that are more soft magic, magic that are beyond the common people. Those may be hidden magic, or they may be the magics that hold society and cities together, but they're not for common people to really understand. The question of high and low fantasy is a weird one when it comes to Manapunk. The basic assumption is low fantasy with high magics. Things are rough and brutal, but magic is powerful. It doesn't mean that magic is easy, which is why I'm maybe hesitating a bit because it makes the high low fantasy question a bit murky because you can have very powerful magics that have such a high price that usually in fantasy no one but the worst villains would ever even dare to use it. But in Manapunk, there are no heroes. Everybody's basically some degree of villain. So if you don't use the horrible magics, you're screwed. So it's a kind of warped sense of low fantasy. It's low fantasy with a high power level because the price you pay for using powerful magics is so high. If you do it more the high fantasy way, you get the problem that high fantasy is usually epic, which means heroic. And that kind of goes against the grain of Manapunk. It can be done, but it usually does not resemble what you would consider high fantasy. The powerful magics of high fantasy and the mighty heroes are likely to become more anti heroes and powerful magics used with a great degree of sacrifice. There is a tragedy to heroism in Manapunk, just as there is in Cyberpunk. Heroes can exist, but they are likely to be tragic because they are fighting against the nature of the entire world, the nature of the beings in power, the nature of their own humanity or whatever race they are. So you can have high fantasy in a Manapunk genre, but it will not be the same positive, optimistic, glorious high fantasy that you would see in classic fantasy. It will be tragic, it will be full of losses and sacrifices and anti heroes. But it can be done. That said, it can still be done. So, if you want to try out Manapunk, start by turning the dial on magic up to 115 and then figure out how that changes society, how prominent magic changes the everyday life for people in general, and then figure out how someone would use that to come into power and what the effects would be on the world. It sounds a bit simpler than it sounds a lot simpler than it is, but those are the core tenets. Let magic grow too far and figure out what that means for society.